illustrious state of Guatemala and the distinguished representatives of the alleged victims, I hereby declare open the public hearing in the case of 13.159 of 14 Comunidades de Pueblo Maya Kichi regarding Guatemala. Before beginning the hearing, I would like to recall that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is celebrating its 65th year of work this year, 2024, committed to the defense and promotion of human rights, thanks to the common interest and pact of the states of the Americas and the Caribbean, and to societies to give life to the American Convention and the Democratic Charter. Since 1959, hundreds of professionals have passed through this institution. I believe thousands have passed through this institution, and individuals, groups, and peoples have turned to the Commission seeking protection, seeking justice, and reparations. We celebrate 65 years of history with more than 100 on-site visits, something to celebrate, with corresponding reports, more than 1,000 precautionary measures granted, more than 750 reports on the merits, 220 friendly settlements, and 377 cases before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. All of this with the victims as a central focus of our work and our priority. To ensure that this hearing is inclusive, we ask all participants to begin their presentations by stating your name, your position, and the organization or institution you represent. Subsequently, each time you take the floor, we ask that you repeat your name at the beginning so that the visually impaired can identify who is speaking. Likewise, we remind you that these audiences have Zoom subtitles available. Each person can activate them directly from their computers and choose the display size. So I think that's for those who are online with us. They are also available for those who follow us through our Inter-American Commission on Human Rights channels. So at this point, I would like to turn over to the Executive Secretary, Tanya Renon, in order to make a reference in relation to this case.
Gracias, Presidenta. Muy buenos días a
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are very pleased to greet everybody in this room. We are looking at a case that puts forward the supposed responsibility of the state in the case of the violent ejecting of 14 indigenous communities, Quechí, from the township of Panzos del Valle del Polcolochic in the department of Alta Verapaz from the 15th to the 23rd of March of 2011. That is something that is imputed to the Army, the police, and irregular forces, with forced displacement and various other results. On the 17th of October of 2017, the Commission notified the parts in this case of Resolution 116 and invited them on the basis of 36.3 of our Rules of Procedure to put forward the case as they saw it and what the actual merits of the case might be. This is what you will have before you today. Thank you.
The presentation of the arguments of the state will begin now. The petitioners will have 25 minutes, and there should be a stop clock, which you can monitor your time. Then the state will have similarly 25 minutes to present its arguments. Subsequently, if the petitioners so wish, they will have another 5 minutes to exercise their right to reply, and the state will have 5 minutes to exercise their right to rejoinder. Finally, the Commission will ask questions of the state. So with that, I give the floor to the petitioners so that they can make their oral presentation within the 25 minutes.
Muy buen día y quiero empezar agradeciendo a la Comisión.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I thank you and the entire Commission, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, for giving us the opportunity to speak to Case 13/59, which was brought forward as a result of forceful displacement in the circumstances that we now know in the Valley of Polochic, in the township of Panzos, back in 2011, 23rd of March of 2011. But the most recent expression of that same pattern of displacement, which is what we're talking about here, has also affected the K'iche' people, always victims of, they feel, of violence, of refusal of access to justice, and acts of fraud throughout the system of registration in this case. And those cases of fraud have been allowed to fester, I might add, and have never been resolved. The victims are still hoping for some resolution, but it's not been had. So let me explain further that over the last couple of years, we have been in touch with the ICHR in as much as 3 of the petitioners have passed away whilst awaiting the opportunity to see their petition prosper, as it were. And alas, there were some problems in communication. We didn't get the notices that presumably were sent. And when we finally did, we had to rush to prepare this hearing as best we could, but here we are. And there are 3 persons here, 3 petitioners who are representing the region and with a great deal of experience working with the victims, and they will themselves explain the history of this eviction and what the impact on the victims has been in their view. So we will begin with Attorney Juan Castro, who represents the victims, Madam President. I am Juan Castro, here for the victims. We are speaking for a number of the communities that have been evicted and that feel forgotten. We know that there is there are 2 different civic groups backing this case as well. I wonder if we could show what we brought. But let me just tell you, the entire valley that is called Polochic, back in 1838, was ceded. We're talking about 68,000 hectares, give or take. But the manner in which this concession, this transferal of land occurred, affected 1,500 areas where there had been horses raised. Now, why is that in any way germane? Because the concession in question, where this land was ceded, it was not given. It wasn't a gift. It was listed as a farm or hacienda 53. And it includes various municipalities of 3 states or departments: Una, La Paz, Tactic, Tamaú, Curubú, La Pinta, Senú, and Patzos de Alto Delgado, and Izabal. Now, the research that we have carried out and verification of the facts to our satisfaction tells us that this land holding had been yielding as a concession, and it involved 700 units. That land had not been dismembered or parceled off until the 80s. And many of the communities that historically lived there, which were for centuries K'iche's land, were displaced because of the war. They were turfed out. And suddenly that land holding kind of fell apart. Various different people came in and landowners, and then all of a sudden the people who had just arrived, called the people who had lived there forever, were called usurpers. Now, we have found 700 caballerías. That's the term in Spanish that is being used. And there are 800 more. It's a unit of land. Don't know what the equivalent in English is, the interpreter points out. But the point is that the northern part of the first 700 caballerías, if you can move to the next slide, here you go. This is the old map, okay, but what you're going to look at, take a look at the center. That is landholding 83. And where it is today, and by the way, this has been confirmed by surveyors, professional surveyors who are linked to these communities, have confirmed that the old measures still obtain, still valid, give or take. What is the trouble? Well, the trouble is that many of those communities in La Paz went home. What they thought were home or was home and always was home, but now they're being turfed out. They're saying, look, you're here usurping your land. In point of fact, they're being arrested for taking over land which is alleged not their own. The point is, many of these were farming palm oil. This is a single crop, and criminal law is being used against them to make sure that they leave. But what we're looking at is that the borders of the north have been moved 2 kilometers up, and that puts them virtually in the pit of a nickel mine. They've been moved up off their land. You look and see what's in red. That is a nickel, the metal nickel mine. And the Inajas, the lower turquoise thing below, is the Inajas farm. 3 major land holdings were dismembered. One of them is the very big one to the right above, which involves the whole of the Pochi Valley. You can see the darker part, that's a valley. And the petitioners here, the communities that are being directly hurt by this, have always lived there. Now, if we take the view of civil law, that concession could not have been adjudicated per se. And all of this dismemberment, the interpreter corrects herself, all of this parceling out that came later is equally unjust because it began wrong and it continued in that same vein. This needs to be revised by the state of Guatemala to ensure how this happened to begin with. And how is it moved on now, guess what, to private lines, where initially and traditionally have been indigenous lands, who lived both on the Sierra Santa Cruz side and on the Sierra Las Minas part, and have been worked on those mines in that entire valley since time immemorial, quite literally.
Buenos días.
I am Heather Teague. I'm an anthropologist, ladies and gentlemen. I have been working among the Quechua communities for 20 years plus in that valley and in the hills of where the mines are. So allow me to add something to what Attorney Juan just said. And here's what I want to say. Before the concession to the railroad, there had been a pattern of abusing the Quechua communities in the sense of robbing their land. They are traditionally from the valley of Colochic, beginning with Colan and moving east and north. They've always lived there. We're talking ancestry. We have archaeology. We have jade carvings, ladies and gentlemen, that show, and patterns of language that show, as well as land holding, that this people, and they are a people, have been there literally, let's call it forever. Beginning with the Spanish colony, which marks the time when there were written land tracts used. That is when these people began to be the losers, because first of all, most of them can't read their own language. Secondly, they most assuredly can't read Spanish. So they could be shown the documents or presumed land holdings in Spanish to Kingdom Come, and they weren't going to understand. This abuse began with the Spanish conquest. Let's say that coming in. Early on, at the beginning of the 19th century, back in the 1800s, okay, 1820 onwards, titles, free landholding titles, were handed out to German colonials, that is, people from Germany who came to settle here, in order to plant coffee, and subsequent to the coffee, other crops as well. These land holdings, which were not land holdings at all, were given to the Europeans coming in unfairly and illegally, turfing out, quite literally, the people who had lived there for centuries. And I hate to say it, but that pattern that goes back to the middle of the 19th century continues as I speak. The people who live there, who have a right to that land because of the use of that land, it's ancestral, have always passed on the land holding to their next of kin, however close the next of kin is, but it's kept in the family. And that pattern only begins to change year on year, very slightly. But it pretty much stays the same. But after the arrival of the European settlers, then all of a sudden, the railroad arrived. Well, that was another great problem. And Chile and cane and also looking for oil for combustible fuel further eroded their ability to till the land, no pun intended. This is the history of the Quechies. The people are agriculturists. They till the land. They are farmers going back millennia probably. But today they are being, again, shut out from their traditional landholding because they don't have written titles, which of course have been handed down up among the settlers. And so now these indigenous peoples, far from being the owners, are, the speaker says in English, indentured servants is the term the specialist is using in English. These people are now indentured servants where for probably millennia, certainly centuries, they owned and cultivated their own land. And they had a right, therefore, to their own hut, their own house on their own land. But they are being turfed out. They are being evicted. So that pattern that began to be felt back in the middle of the last century has only accelerated and is very deep-rooted at this stage. The types of production, therefore, have perhaps shifted a little bit, but let me say that the Quechua community deeply requires, ladies and gentlemen of this commission, a resolution to this problem that goes to the root thereof. They must be accorded the right to be seen, to be and to act as the owners of their ancestral land. I could go on, and I have more to say if you wish for more details, cultural details as to how these communities have survived. I can say more, but for now I will stop there. Thanks very much. Rafael Gonzalez of Cook. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Commission and representatives of the government who are present here. Greetings to all of you. I hope I can be heard perfectly. After this situation that has been described by my colleagues, where back in 2011 the owners were turfed out and shut out of their own land. The problem has only worsened, and because the problem here is certainly the wrong distribution of the land, the erroneous distribution, the illegal distribution of the land in all three cases. And the people who have arrived have simply taken over, and many fewer people are now the so-called landowners. And the people who had forever been there appear to be out of luck. The state is not dealing with this matter, not in a profound manner. They haven't gone to the root of the problem. And therefore, this people no longer has land to till, on top of which they have literally been thrown off the land altogether. They can't even live there. I can't remember the exact year when there was talk of reaching some kind of arrangement. 2 or 3 land holdings were handed over as a tentative compromise, but when you got down to it, potable water, schools, health centers were not available, and what was there was only written on paper, but in truth, nothing happened. The community of San Pascal in the area called La Paz, that community, ladies and gentlemen, had been shut off their own land. And the land that they gave was impossible to till, because guess what? Every year it floods. You can't plant anything that grows because before it comes to maturity, it's flooded and rotted. That's probably why they were given that land. And so, from what we have looked at and the precautionary measures that have been granted, we know, per those agreements, that there is 3 times a year certain lands, but not appropriate. And the products that are sent to be planted are already half dead. They're dry. So they're being sent infra-quality products. And so the bottom line here is that we feel it is vitally important to go back to square one and give these people a chance to recover their lands and the means to till that land. The economic element here is something that needs mentioned too, because even when there is something to harvest, there are not the means to do it. And when all of a sudden there is some weather situation that arises, as it ever does, it's a dead loss. And it happens time and again. And so we feel that the question of the development of communities that were already given land, we can't say, oh, well, look, these people did get land. Because if you look at the facts, poverty has grown worse. Last year, there were numerous deaths among the children for malnutrition. How is it possible in a country where there is an abundance of hectares of land where people should be able to farm? Far from it. You've got kids dying of hunger because they have nothing to eat. Why? Because there were no crops. Why? Because the land was not useful to that end. And so, yet again, we think it is high time that the question of responsibility should be looked at. There are more than 800 families that have been evicted, and 45%, the state of Guatemala says, have been looked at, but that is not the case, because even when you look at what some people have gotten, the situation is not good. They have to wait to have the state bring them the food because the crops didn't prosper. And to make matters worse, as if they could be worse, the quality of the food that the state provides is infra the levels that could be called acceptable. And they have not the means to do better in the next harvest. So they feel trapped, they feel abused, and we can only hope that the hope, I should say, of reaching some agreement worthy of the name with the state is still before us. But agreement 169 states that there has to be consent, informed consent by the communities before any measure is taken. And that has yet to happen. We need a roundtable in Guatemala with the peasants community, with anybody else who has a stake in this matter, so that we can begin by actually putting our money where our mouth is and move forward.
We would like to sum up by saying that the state plays a direct role in these violations that took place in 2011. In 2005, 2006, at that time, there wasn't much agro industry. The state did do a great deal of planning to plan for agro-industry in the Valley of Polo Chic. And these rural and indigenous families, the Quechies, starting in the 2000s, had been operating in the framework of the peace accords, the purchase of their historic ancestral lands as part of their territory through a mechanism called Frontera, which came alongside the peace accords. The landholders had lost interest in the area. In many cases, they were very interested in selling their lands, and the communities had reached agreements with the state to purchase those. However, a sugar cane company arrived, the owner of which was the brother-in-law of the First Lady at the time, and they got funding from the Central American Development Bank for the purchase of a vast percentage of the Polo Chic lands. Now, this could only happen with the okay of the state of Guatemala, and that was to give the green light for the loan to that sugarcane factory. And again, the owner of that factory, of that enterprise, was the brother-in-law of the First Lady at the time, and this set off a new wave of violence against these communities. And one of the most well-known incidents of violence was the Panzos massacre, which was a direct result of the community's efforts to get title to their lands with the state. So persons with influence and persons with connections are the ones who walked away with the title to the land, even though these communities had been managing the lands. So again, it was the state and it was business people with connections to senior government officials. They came in and they started burning down towns. There were murders, and it was a very violent wave of incidents against these communities. So there is a very direct involvement of the state.
Would you like to conclude, please?
So, de manera de conclusiones,
In conclusion, the Quechua community has been on these lands for centuries without access to lands, living on fraudulently titled lands. In 2011, things got worse. But now, in 2024, the opportunity to redress
I
that.
think the representative states you will have, I think it's about 26 minutes. You have the same time that they had. So please do begin.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, honorable members of the Inter-American Commission, petitioners, and to their representatives. I'm Julio Roberto Saavedra Pineta, and I am here to legally represent Guatemala as the Attorney General of the nation. I am here with Hector Osvaldo Samayo Sosa, the Executive Director of the Commission for Peace and Human Rights. We have come to share Guatemala's observations on the case at hand. The state of Guatemala would like to state, before discussing the merits of the case, that we are a pluricultural country comprised of different indigenous peoples who descend from the Mayas. They have rights and prerogatives that have been established in our Constitution. The Constitution also establishes protection for all indigenous lands and all types of collective ownership of land to ensure quality of life for those communities. And this has been upheld by our Constitutional Court through its case law, having established that the communities living in these different municipalities enjoy constitutional protections as they defend their rights and interests, collective and individual, through those who are recognized as their representatives through practices and customs. So this is the legitimate actions of indigenous peoples to work on their own behalf. So the government and our president, Bernardo Arevalo, in pursuant to what was said on the 7th of February, signed a commitment with 5 campesina organizations, among them the CUC, which is representing the petitioners. There are a number of different organizations, the Committee of Altiplano and the organization Nuevo Dia. This expressly recognizes the historic importance of campesino claims to their land, as were written in the peace accords in the article having to do with rural development and agriculture. We have a national policy on integral development that was approved through Agreement 169 of the ILO. An agreement was reached on the following: agrarian conflict, access to lands for communities, rural development, and communication between campesino organizations and the government. In this specific case, that commitment is key to address the claims being brought forth. And there is also a sustainable institutional framework to deal with this. The private secretariat of the presidency, which includes a special secretariat for dialogue, which ensures robust participation by the government in these dialogues. In the formulation and implementation of an agrarian policy that will guarantee existing constitutional rights, including the recognition of indigenous or rural communities' rights to land, whether they are collective or individual, in order to ensure quality of life for those communities. the state expresses its full willingness to address this case through a friendly settlement. And we want to look at the progressive development of the human rights of the petitioners. To that end, I will now give the floor to the Executive Director of COPAI so that he may go into further details on that agreement, as well as to request that the Honorable Commission allow us to put up a PowerPoint and so that the speaker may advance the slides as his presentation moves on. Thank you, Attorney General, and good morning to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights as well as to the petitioners present. The government of Guatemala recognizes the priority of addressing this case, particularly those who are currently at risk because of lack of access to their territories. For the 2024-2028 term, as the Attorney General stated, the government will address the claims being put forth by different campesino organizations. On this point, the government has gone back to point 27 of the peace accords on rural development, which specifies that this matter and rural development are fundamental for the full expression of those communities. As we heard on February 7th, the government signed a commitment on 5 different areas that we consider key to rural development and development in the country. On the 16th of February, an agreement went into effect whereby the private secretariat of the Office of the President created a section for dialogue, which is strengthened by the Office on Dialogue. There is a Campesino Council that is comprised of the organizations that signed on to the commitment. The Office on Human Rights and the Peace Accords has put forth as item 1 to resolve the situation of the present case, and the Office of the Undersecretary, in coordination with the Frontera Board of Directors, will do everything necessary to resolve this situation, this case. This commitment that was signed on February 7th looks at strengthening the land fund or Fondo Tierras. This will facilitate access to the lands. COPADE has committed, this Commission for Peace and Human Rights will do all of the coordination needed to ensure that the Office of the Private Secretariat and the Governance Office, as well as the Board of Frontera, will come up with an agreement that is amenable to all. In terms of the petition, as well as the precautionary measure, the Commission at some point saw the need for humanitarian measures to be implemented. In the year 2024, the Vice Ministry on Food Assistance will include corn and other foodstuffs to ensure that each of the communities will have access to native seeds for their crops, including corn now. In addition to the efforts of that commission, we have made education and development priorities. This is tied to the aforementioned commitment by the government, and items 3 and 4 talk about territorial coordination. In this case, there are territories that have been prioritized for some of the efforts of COPADE, And of course, we will prioritize the territorial coordination in the area where these communities reside. This is important because this will help achieve sustainability. There will be humanitarian assistance as part of this commitment. In terms of the friendly settlement, the idea is to include all of the elements of the commitment that were signed by these campesino organizations as well. And we will work through this council. The state believes that as part of the commitment, the measures included therein are a roadmap forward. And the Presidential Commission for Peace and Human Rights, and bearing in mind what happened in 2011, is now proposing the preparation of audiovisual materials that will provide training to the police about police force, use of force, in an effort to professionalize the police even more and to ensure the physical safety of the communities being policed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Based on what we've just heard, the illustrious Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I hope, will see the good faith on the part of the government. We reiterate our willingness to work toward a friendly settlement in this case. And based on what was said, we are trying to prioritize dialogue with the petitioners and their representatives. We would like, through the Inter-American Commission, to have a list of all of those who would be the beneficiaries of this friendly settlement, as well as who the leaders who will be representing them will be. And if the petitioners agree to the beginning of discussions on friendly settlements, we would ask the Commission to transfer this to your portfolio on friendly settlements and to suspend the precautionary measure. And the State of Guatemala would ask the commissioners that in the time remaining, we would like the representatives of the petitioners to consider this, consider this proposal for a friendly settlement, and if they decide against it, then the government would ask for its remaining time.
Yes. Solicitando si se puede pausar el cronómetro.
Yes, can you stop the clock at this time? We have concluded for the moment, but wanted to put that forth to the petitioners.
And we really do appreciate your consideration of a friendly settlement process. I would like, before I turn over to Commissioner Pochak, who's the country rapporteur, I would like to ask the petitioners if you have any response. You have 5 minutes.
I would like to address 2 points in terms of the evictions. We know that the issue in the country has not changed thus far. There are persons who are very corrupt who are putting up obstacles to the democratic process. Unfortunately, they have a lot of influence. The Supreme Court, the Office of the Prosecutor General, Congress. Even in the initial days of the new administration, there were evictions. This is something that is of great concern to us. When they say there will be no further violent evictions, when communities are evicted, even if no one's taken prisoner, in a matter of speaking, or even if nobody is harmed physically, these are still violent because we are seeing violations of our rights to food, our rights to have a place to live as families. So what can be done for this to be redressed? We want families to be free, have free rights to our land, and what we have asked for in the past is investigations, because then a process of dialogue could begin on the matter of land and land ownership, because there are certain lands that are in the hands of persons who have a lot of influence at legal level. And so that is of great concern for us. Evictions are still taking place. People are concerned. This continues to occur. Those are things that I'm hoping that the government will take into account and will take measures. What we want to hear is that there will be no further violent evictions, and that families will be physically safe. This is something that the government is in a position to promise so that we can then deal with the matter at hand. As to a friendly settlement, we have seen in the Cook, this is something that we've discussed. We think it would be a great path forward so that we can start putting things in black and white. If there were ways of coming to a friendly settlement that would indeed benefit the communities and families, we would certainly be amenable to that. But we would need time to engage in consultations and to inform our communities about the process. We have a committee. We can have a committee to deal with the matter of a friendly settlement. So I do believe that is something we would support, and it is something that we will continue to discuss amongst ourselves. Yes, just to conclude, these 5 petitioning organizations met last week. The conclusion was that we would first need to consult with the communities to gain their consent to enter into a friendly settlement process. We would therefore ask that we be afforded due time to engage in those consultations and to present this option to the communities. We would need to have a better understanding of what the government has in mind as far as possible solutions are concerned, because the right that the communities are asserting is the right to their ancestral territories faced with imminent risk of starvation, or to purchase lands in areas outside of the territory. This would not solve the historic dispossession of lands. These are lands that they have occupied for millennia, for centuries. We have seen that there are many, many families who continue into, even though they're maybe going hungry, see the need to return to their ancestral lands because those are indigenous lands. Thank you.
Commissioners and representatives of the state, you have also 6 minutes to respond for rejoinder.
Muchas gracias. Pues ante
Thank you. Given the willingness we've seen, it is very important in that we reiterate the commitment of the Arevalo administration to these campesino organizations. And again, this was signed on February 7th, this very month. This commitment provides a framework of what the support the state of Guatemala would be willing to lend. As among the topics included, there are matters as important as looking at conflict, agrarian development, crisis, dealing with the crisis, which is what we've heard. Then we have access to land for these rural communities. Then we have rural economy, which is key, the territorial coordination. And then the last, which is extremely important, is adherence to any agreements. This is the commitment of the Arevalo administration in the framework of initial talks, respecting at all times the rights of the communities, particularly as far as consultation is concerned. So the state of Guatemala can provide in writing the proposal we have in mind so that you would have an idea and a formal level of what our position is. I would like to reiterate the commitment of President Arevalo and its institutions, the commitment to rule of law. And with that, I conclude.
Of the state, and I would like to turn over now to our country rapporteur, Commissioner Pochak.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and good morning to both the petitioners and the illustrious state of Guatemala. I am very pleased to be in this hearing your positions and this possibility of dialogue. I very much celebrate this possibility of a friendly settlement. We've seen this offer of a friendly settlement, and it is also framed within the newer openness of the administration from Guatemala with the Commission. Just a few weeks ago, the Commission was able, for the first time in many years, to visit Guatemala and have the state receive an in-local visit of the Commission. So this is a very welcome change in position, and we see the administration's commitment to human rights. This friendly settlement, if it is going to come to fruition, will have to get the shared commitments. Therefore, the petitioners will do the necessary consultations with the communities to facilitate dialogue. I do have some specific questions for the parties so that we can facilitate this, to understand the scope of the offerings in this framework, the measures the state is willing to provide. First question, does the state recognize, or is it willing to recognize, that these 14 indigenous communities had ancestral ownership of the land that they are laying claim to in Polo Chic? And if so, what is the surface area that the state believes correspond to the states? You may not have that information on hand, but this would be information would be requesting for future discussions. In terms of institutional measures and community property, of course, we would be looking for some specific measures as well as non-repetition measures. As the Inter-American Court in 2023 talked about Guatemala, said it's important to talk about institutional measures being developed to ensure that cases such as this do not continue to occur, that there are no continued evictions, and to allow communities to peacefully exercise their community ownership. And then I am specifically interested in knowing what's happening with the investigation and punishment of those who perpetrated the violent evictions? Does the state have information during the processing of the petition? They were looking at the investigation into one of the deaths in 2012. The chief of the Special Forces of the National Civil Police was indicted. This became an international case. And currently, this individual's in pretrial detention. What happened? Was there a trial? What other investigations have been carried out? What have been the outcomes in terms of those who were potentially harmed during the violent evictions? And then I would like to ask the state, how will the public prosecution office be involved? If there's without any progress in these investigations and punishment, no friendly settlement will be possible. And then finally, and the state has already, in a way, responded to this, but this is in the framework of a friendly settlement in terms of providing information and measures for non-repetition, proportional use of force, and all of these actions and activities for training. I think the friendly settlement should include that on its agenda. And so I would ask the petitioners, in principle, what position do you hold vis-a-vis this request made by the state in terms of determining the number of beneficiaries so are you in a position to tell us how many people or how many indigenous communities would be involved? Maybe not the number of people, but some conditions in terms of the friendly settlement would be determining the number of individuals who would be beneficiaries.
Finalmente le pregunto al Estado.
And finally, I would like to ask the state to respond to the petitioner's insistence on the fact that a special round table or a special group be set up, a mesa table specific, be set up to deal with this. I hope that the response is in principle positive. It seems to be, aside from any further steps taken. But it would be good to know whether such consultation is indeed going to take place. I think that'll take some time, quite naturally, and on the state side as well, it'll take some time for people to get together. But the Commission needs to be able to issue its merits report on the matter and needs the information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you very much to both the petitioners and the state. My apologies for speaking in English, but I hope you will understand me fully in the translation. Again, like my colleague, I welcome the indications from the state and for a friendly settlement and the amenability of the petitioners for this. But because this is from what you describe, an ongoing issue, and because also it is a discrete, this case concerns a discrete set of communities, 14 communities, I'd just like to have a better sense, perhaps, of the institutional situation, picking up on the theme of my colleague. The petitioners, you've spoken about the long period under which these dispossessions occurred, and the fact that they're ongoing. But the state, you've also pointed out that the Constitution protects indigenous lands. So, if I could get some clarity from both of you, given the fact that there is this constitutional protection, before lands are ceded, what protections or procedures exist in domestic law for following or for respecting ancestral rights? Is this only, are the procedures only for those that are formally titled, or is there a wider recognition? And I'm particularly curious about this if the protection is constitutional. So how is this dispossession going on, given the the protection that there is there. In terms of the scope of the friendly settlement, I'm also interested in, so you've spoken, the petitioners, you've spoken about the expression that I heard was the turfing, and so the communities who've been ancestrally living there and farming being moved off in favor of companies that are now constructing, and so a range of activities. For the 14 specific communities, what's the status of this lands, of these lands from which they have been dispossessed? And in the context of a proposed settlement, is there a possibility of them returning to those lands? One of the petitioners, one of the members, I'm sorry, I missed that name. I think it might have been Mr. Gonzalez. You spoke of lands that have been given that are wholly inadequate. Now, in the event that there is contemplated alternative lands, what protections or measures are there for, in law, are there any, I should ask, are there any procedures or protections in formal law for allocating alternative lands of similar value, similar character? But I would be particularly interested in knowing the status of the lands from which these communities have been displaced. And finally, could you please update us for all of the communities that have been from 2011 that have been displaced or evicted, what's their current status, both in terms of where they're living and how they're surviving in the context of these very harsh conditions that you've described? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Bulkan. I turn over to First Vice President, Commissioner Bernal.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks very much indeed, Madam President. I'd like to echo what the rapporteur has said and what the rapporteur have also said. Thanks very much, first and foremost, for the opportunity to have this exchange of views, this dialogue. I would like very much to spur ongoing dialogue on both parties, because I do believe the government when it says that it is in the in total agreement with continuing the dialogue. So is there a chance that this proposal might be considered? In one respect, it would save a lot of time, because in the analysis for admissibility, which hasn't been fully carried out, I mean, we'd have to say, well, you know, if you're going to drill down, you'd have to have a merits report and go on, and there'd have to be much more time devoted to the subject. So if you're willing to move forward, this would be the time to do it. Now, all of that said, understand, the Commission will certainly defend this agreement. That's point one. Secondly, the Commission is always willing to offer the technical backstopping, the technical support, which I would very much urge be availed of, because we all know, you know, the willingness to talk and to reach compromise is one thing, but when something is as technical and as very complex as this matter is, you may well need that kind of technical support. The two commissioners who have spoken before me have each said, and I would pursue that line, that a friendly settlement, I believe, would have to rest on three different types of measures to begin with. That's for starters. First of all, a group of measures that would be urgent. What's urgent? First of all, what's urgent is to offer security to the communities that are there, so that they are not going to continue to be turfed out and displaced either by private parties or the government, such that those communities can feel yet again secure and free where they are. Plus, I think there has to be a report, and what the commissioner, the rapporteur, had already said, we need more on the urgent measures that it has been understood really have to be taken. But there's another cluster of measures, I believe, that are also urgent, but perhaps are more structural in their nature. And here I refer to offering conditions that would be deemed dignified, civil, acceptable to the communities involved. In other words, the fact that people have been turfed off their land, and worse yet, they don't have access to education. They don't have access to a place to farm or to have water, not even have basic hygiene, or have access to conditions that are by any stretch of the imagination considered a situation in which they could be employed. That is unacceptable. That has to be considered, I would think, a top priority that the government must address. Finally, I would point out a matter that is more structural and for that reason perhaps more complex, and that goes directly to the question of land and land distribution. Annie pointed something out with which I agree very much. First of all, I agree that point one, we need to know whether yea or nay, this is ancestral land. Is it or is it not ancestral land? Because Guatemala, we know, is not only part of this convention, but they are also signers of the ILO convention, which is opposite here. I think it's 140. But the appropriate International Labor Organization convention that also has a bearing here. Not to mention what Commissioner Balkan properly pointed out, which is that we must consider, you must consider, the possibility of somehow compensating for acceptable lands. People who have been turfed off their land can't just take any old land that maybe isn't worth the money that it's being written off on. If these are ancestral lands, there has to be some equitable restitution. That is the term. So that the situation ex ante being dispossessed could be reestablished. I don't mean to prolong the matter, but it does seem to me that those conditions would be the minimum starting place for negotiation. And I would also reiterate, in my judgment, all of these measures will have direct influence and impact on the indigenous communities. And so this public law has to be subject for consultation. It can't be, okay, you group, tell us yes or not, and we'll, in a great hurry, write this down. There has to be agreement between the two, and it has to be freely given. Thank you very much.
Caballero.
Gracias, Presidenta. Muy buenas tardes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. I wish you all a good afternoon, and I greet the petitioners. Very pleased to have you among us, and also the distinguished delegation of the state of Guatemala. I'd like to pick up on something that the commissioners have already pointed out and make this a very specific, shall I say, not a, but several specific questions to the state with regard to companies, to enterprises, in other words, to the private sector, which, let's be clear, has greatly benefited from this issue. Here we go. What happens with the tracts of land that have been turned into great landowning estates? What happens? What happens when an extension of land that isn't legally agreed, it just is taken arbitrarily? This would be impunity. Now, what happens further to the position that companies, that the private sector might make into an objection before the state? What happens there? And beyond that, and looking on us down a longer-term horizon, When we hear the issue of ancestral rights, Article 166 and 167 of the Constitution, I always look at that because it's very important. What do you intend to offer the private sector as clarity with regard to their investments? Thank you. Thank you.
And over to you, Commissioner Demise, if you have anything to add.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all petitioners and state. I want to be brief because I think the fellow commissioners have been very clear in their points. I just wanted to ask one question to the state that has to do with measures that ensure access to food and water for the communities, if they can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Demise. And I want to join my fellow commissioners in thanking the petitioners and the representatives of the state for your presentations, and also for the highly welcomed suggestion on entering into a friendly settlement. And I'm certainly sure the Commission will provide all of the technical support to ensure that the friendly settlement discussions proceed. I have two questions, well, maybe three. One, having regard to the constitutional protections to which you have referred representatives of the state, I want to know, is there a law or a policy or a practice requiring the state to investigate ancestral possession prior to titling land to the benefit of non-Indigenous persons? And secondly, I want to ask about the investigations, because in the eviction, harm was done. That's the allegation of the petitioners, that there was harm done and life lost. And I want to ask representative of the state, has this been investigated, and what is the status of investigation? And finally, from the vantage point of non-repetition, is there a state policy on managing evictions of persons from ancestral lands? Thank you very much. So we know that you all may not be able to answer all of the questions. Okay. And I have someone else to speak as well, but I just want to let you know that these are questions you can also send in your responses to by in a written form. But before we turn over to you, thank you, Executive Secretary, for reminding me that my task is not done at the head table, and that, in fact, we have quite a few other people here whom we want to say something. Deputy Executive Secretary Jorge Mesa, please go ahead.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta, y con su venia seré.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will be very, very brief and mention this for whatever purposes might be found useful. First of all, I'd like to know from the state what is the scope of the case as they see it, because the territory that is in question here, I'd like to know whether in a friendly settlement the state will recognize, or has already recognized for that matter, that we're talking about land that belongs to those communities that are saying, you better believe that's our land. It is our land ancestrally. And so if that's the case, how has this in any way been turned into landholding by others? And how do you deal with those concessions? What companies, what private companies are operating here? And will the state recognize that perhaps there was a mistake and a lack of sufficient due diligence as regards the checking with the actual owners? Would the state, in this case, recognize the responsibility for having allowed people to be evicted from land that ancestrally was those people's land? And so in the possibility of a friendly settlement, would any of these elements, as Commissioner Bolcom rightly pointed out, what kind of reparations would you be talking about? In what circumstances do you foresee, and in what conditions, a return of people to their ancestral lands? Thanks very much.
Rapporteur Pelumo.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks very much to the commissioners. Very briefly indeed, I think, quite bluntly, the question that I wanted to pose, Commissioner Caballero has already put forth, and so I would echo that question and go to the possibility of one of the enterprises, in as much as it has its headquarters in Switzerland, if I understood, could thereby avail itself of the treaty that has been signed between Guatemala and Switzerland, and given the antecedents that obtain here in terms of mines and so forth, I'd like to know what the state was thinking. How does it expect dealing with that aspect of things, and what possible modifications might be perhaps offered to those enterprises if agreement with these communities is reached? Thank you.
Special Rapporteur. Now I turn over to the representatives of the petitioners for response to any of the, you have many questions. So over to you. And you have 5 minutes to respond.
Well, thank you very much indeed. While Article 67 of the Constitution recognizes these various different forms of landholding, this is nonetheless a very sticky issue, a difficult question in Guatemala, because there's no norm that has been used, that has been recognized as our own means of availing ourselves of what we spiritually and traditionally have exercised as our right to that land. And to recognize that ancestral right, let me simply say that back in the day, there were some decrees constitutionally that began to recognize this, but all of a sudden, the Constitutional Court changed. And suddenly then the jurisprudence that was being used also changed. And all of a sudden we had to go back to the ordinary route and not that other route which was more expedited. And having to go back to the via ordinaria, you'd have to go back and use a title. Well, guess what? There never was a title. Communities, as we know historically, have an ancestral and spiritual link to the land. There's no spiritual title. Didn't fall from heaven. The state doesn't have this, and though the state needs to recognize what that ancestral reality is, and I think it is a structural issue. I can see that perhaps the state would say, well, you know what, we will just buy the land, but that is by no means something that recognizes ancestral rights. You and I all recognize that one thing doesn't presuppose the other. So just buying the land, well, buying what land? The land doesn't belong to the, they're not there to be sold. The land is ancestrally that of these people. Now, in the peace agreements, there were institutions that spoke to this. One of them is the Secretariat or the Ministry on Agrarian Issues. But under Alejandro Gianmattei, the previous government, guess what? He closed that secretariat. He closed that ministry. Doesn't exist anymore. Done and dusted. And so we, who know that the land was taken from the ancestral people who owned it, and land titles have now been, in our view, most improperly been issued with that regard, on that regard. It's going to be, let me say, a very, very tough issue and a very difficult way to find some form of dialogue with the third parties, because as we all know, maybe some of the companies that are there bought in good faith. What's going to be done with them? They bought in good faith. And so, if we do go the route of friendly settlement, I'll tell you one thing we would desperately hope for some pretty good experts on the subject, because I think all of us in this room recognize we're going to need them. You can't just say, oh, no problem, we'll buy them and just send them off. That would be simply kicking the can down the road, who knows for how many years or centuries. This hacienda, number 83, that was just recently dispossessed. So we know that there are companies that are in the business, quite literally, of gobbling up as much land as they possibly can, as best they can, and we'll see how we go. Well, but that can't be the way. And the question of ongoing dispossession is one thing, and there's also, not to forget, there is constant criminal persecution that is being provided against these people. Thank you. I believe that the historic elements that needed to be brought forward have been, I think, well brought out. And the history is there for a reason. History matters. But as we said, once the peace agreement was signed, the peace agreement seemed like a good deal, but all of a sudden, who remembered it? And little by little, I'm sorry to say, and I'm going to be very blunt, the state has thrown that peace agreement into the dustbin. It's just been torn up and forgotten. And that leaves us where we are. And this has plunged the country in great depths of poverty. Oh, yes, there's a great talk about economic growth in Guatemala, but I assure you, and there's no indigenous family that's going to say, oh, we're doing just fine, thank you. We're doing even better. Far from it. Guatemala, I think many will agree, is one of the countries that is most impoverished in the world. That's not just in Latin America. One of the poorest in the world. You look it up. As Juan said, under John Matei, we went backwards in a very, very lamentable way. There had been measures taken, there had been strides taken to tackle the agrarian issue and look at the ancestral matter head on. Well, all of that is gone. We have a case near Livingston and the Stork in the Sierra Santa Cruz, where a legal structure had been agreed upon to defend that land, but in the property registry, nobody recognizes because the road was traced, should have had special title, and those people who are gaining from this have at no point recognized the ancestral rights. They simply say, sorry, it's not there. I think when it is said that the Guatemalan Constitution is one of the best in Latin America, well, maybe one day, but it is being kicked around and crumbling as it goes. There is, people talk about the right to life, the right of the people to do this or that, but as Carlos Bernal rightly pointed out, I'm sad to say, Guatemala may have a very good constitution, and it may be great on paper, but I'm here to tell you that it's not being implemented. And the reason for that is that there are people that have the economic and in some cases military strength to keep it from being implemented. So where does that leave us? That leaves society hanging in the balance, I put it to you. And as the representative of the state said, I couldn't agree more, we're going to have to make a very, very valiant effort, and I hope that the state and the agrarian sector, the peasants involved here, can join forces and talk about development with some degree of integrity. You can't be one people developing and the rest we don't care about.
Representative petitioners, I just want to recognize we're past the time for your response, but we do have some time because the state didn't use all the time. With your permission, can we give the petitioners 2 more minutes to conclude? Please do.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in English this time so I can make sure to be really as clear as I can. Hopefully the translation will come through well for you all in Spanish. I wanted to talk a little bit more to answer the questions about the status of the land now and the patterns of tenancy. At the time right before the evictions occurred, the company Chavialutza had been quietly acquiring lands all throughout the Polochic Valley along Highway 7. On the marsh side, some of which overlaps protected biosphere reserves, protected wetlands. It's very sensitive marsh areas that go as the Polochic River, which is Guatemala's largest freshwater source, goes out into Lake Izabal and then later into the Caribbean. And those lands were prime territory because Chavialutza needed marshlands. Sugar requires an enormous amount of water. They had used up the resources on the south coast where they had previously been located. And so as they went along trying to acquire as much land as they could in that area, some of the properties were owned with the owner occupying the land. There was a lot of cattle ranching in that area originating in the 70s when there was a push to develop cattle as a export. Some of the other properties were owned, but they were not being used by the owner. They were being rented, or they were being occupied by families who had been born onto those lands when their families were indentured servants for the owners, and they had continued living there under mostly informal agreements with the owners who had the titles. So this pattern of indentured servitude has continued and continues to present day, where some of the families were, they have their little house, they have to do a certain amount of work for the owner, and then they can farm a certain little plot for their own needs. Even in so doing, they're still not able to meet basic needs. This group of people has been in an almost continuous hunger crisis since before the evictions. The desperation of that crisis, combined with the pressures from the monoculture and the mining, pushed them to, eke out what they could on these lands where there were not many other options. And so then when we move, all of a sudden the communities get news that they're being evicted. As you all know from the petition, they were in negotiations with the government. The Secretariat of Agriculture had promised that there would not be violence, that there would not be evictions when the leaders went home. They couldn't even get home. The army troops and the riot police, the tear gas bombs were waiting for them, blocking the roads. They could not get home to their communities in the valley. So just to make that a point too, to kind of respond to the state and your gesture to act in good faith, and that you're asking us to trust you and through us, the beneficiaries, to trust you. The beneficiaries have no reason to trust you. So this is part of the reason why, even though we would all like to have hope in Arevalo and Semilla and everything that this new administration is doing, these communities have no reason to trust you. And so if we are going to be able to move forward in trying to find a good solution to the root of these problems, We really have to work very closely with the communities to build that trust that has been broken generation after generation. There have been children who starved to death in these communities since the evictions, during the evictions. You know, that's on top of the more immediate murders that took place during the violence. So those forms of tenancy haven't really changed that much. Some communities have been relocated to fincas, as my colleagues have mentioned already. Some of those lands are not optimal. Some of those lands are not farmable. They can't get water. There are communities with no potable water and no reasonable way to get potable water. So the communities, even though they now have, those few that relocated now have land, they have a title, it doesn't mean anything because it hasn't bettered their situations in life or given them access to possibilities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like to turn over to the representatives of the state for your response.
Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you. Honestly, what we've heard here will require a responsible and complete and truthful response. And so, and we will make clear what the full intent of the state is. But I could throw some things out there, but I would like to insist on the need for the Guatemalan state to have sufficient time to put together the information and data that the Commission is requesting, and from what we've heard from the petitioners. I would like to reiterate that those of us present and our agencies have been working to provide responses to these types of historic issues that have been a problem in our republic, and these are problems that have existed for decades. And we have heard talk about the reform of the secretariat that can address with this, and then there is this signed commitment, and we would like the Commission to follow up on some of the agreements that fall under this commitment, and those could include an improved institutional framework. The director here might be able to speak very briefly about this institutional framework. Thank you. It is clear that what we're hearing from the petitioners is true in terms of the shutdown of the Secretariat for Agricultural Affairs, the Secretariat on Peace, and the agency known as COPREDE. The Presidential Commission on Dialogue was also shut down. I am now privileged to be a part of retaking that commission thanks to President Arevalo. On January 24th of this year, we had a decree issued where the commission was given the responsibilities and the mandate to continue to ensure implementation of the peace accord. So the executive has shown its clear interest in moving forward with the peace accords. And even in late January, there was a public event on the National Day for Respect and Dignity for the Victims of the Conflict. It's important to underscore this because the Commission, our Commission, has started to work to move the matter of agrarian reform to another secretariat so that dialogue and governance can continue in an effort to address conflicts in the country and to develop structural policies that will help to address some of the problems we've seen historically in Guatemala. These were part of the efforts of the current president. This, I believe, is proof of the willingness of the government to move forward in these areas. Thank you very much. And just to wrap up, it is our understanding that awaiting the response of both the petitioners and we will respond to the questions put forth by the commission, the rapporteur. We would again ask for enough time so that we can gather the data and then put our response in writing. Thank you very much.
Representatives of the state and representatives of the petition, but I would like to ask Deputy Executive Secretary Jorge Mesa to help us understand the ways in which the Commission can facilitate the friendly settlements dialogue process and how this can be accessed.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The proposed offer for friendly settlement made by the state has been conveyed to the petitioners in writing. We would hope that you could engage in consultations in 2 weeks, if it's possible. And so, through a note, we've asked for observations, final observations and comments on matters having to do with the present case within 30 days of this hearing. Thank you very much.
I want to thank everyone for their participation. This is one of the hearings where we come to a result that is a hopeful, optimistic one, which is a commitment to dialogue between the state and the representatives of petitioners. We really also understand and hear very clearly when you say trust has to be built. And that trust will be built through dialogue, through meeting of commitments, through clear relationships of accountability between the state and the representatives of the petitioners. And we wish you well, and the Commission is ready to provide the technical support. And with that, I bring this hearing to a close.